Hello and welcome to the Starting Death Guard series, the series in which we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the Death Guard faction. In this video we'll be looking at the different plague companies, which will be presented from the most common in tournament play to the least common, and in cases where a plague company has not placed within a tournament, I will use my best judgment to form an opinion of where the company ranks. We'll also take a look at the Deadly Pathogen special rules afterwards to give full context of what makes the Death Guard so special. Unlike most other factions that contain sub-factions where units within the detachment of that sub-faction as a whole gain some benefit, the Death Guard sub-factions known as plague companies only offer 3 benefits to their plague companies, being a stratagem, a relic, and a warlord trait that functions as a contagion. For those new to the faction, a contagion is an aura debuff that Death Guard units emit within a certain range, and that range is determined by the battle round number unless otherwise modified by abilities or stratagems. Some contagions are army-wide, while others, like the plague company warlord traits, are specifically on a certain model. The lack of universal detachment benefits makes the plague companies less impactful, but still keeps them at a rather reasonable power level, and with something like the Flash Outbreak stratagem that lets you duplicate contagions for a period of time, the warlord trait does get some extra mileage in many cases. However, the Death Guard do have plenty of strong generic traits and relics, so it's important to keep that in mind as well when discussing the plague companies and what they offer to the detachment. The first and most common plague company within the Death Guard forces is the Inexorable. Their stratagem is called Ferric Miasma, and for 1 command point you can reduce the charge range of an enemy charging an Inexorable unit by 2 inches. This can be rather useful as you can prevent a charge in a lot of cases against one of your units, leaving your enemy stranded in shooting and in charge range of your own forces. However, do note you do have to use this when the target of the charge is declared, so you cannot wait to see what the roll is for your opponent. That means if they are within 10 inches of your unit, they can still potentially make the charge if they roll very well, or use miracle dice if their sister's a battle player. So in some cases this might do everything, and in other cases you might end up getting no benefit at all if your opponent is very lucky. Though even with that in mind, it's still a rather good stratagem that can do a lot of work in the correct circumstances. The warlord trait is a contagion known as Ferric Blight, and is rather strong as it reads that when an Inexorable unit makes an attack against an enemy within range of this contagion, you add 1 to the armor penetration of that attack profile. Right now armor penetration is very important in the game, and being able to give it to key units can turn mediocre attacks into rather frightening ones. Not to mention with Flash Outbreak you can have it in effect in multiple locations, even though you can't have it cumulatively add up, as no contagion can be cumulative even if enemy models are exposed to multiple instances of it. This warlord trait contagion is definitely a selling point for the Inexorable plague company, as it can really take your attacks to the next level, and the fact that it debuffs all enemies within the range of the contagion is rather powerful, considering that it can give every attack made against them 1 extra armor penetration that adds up very fast. The relic of the Inexorable, on the other hand, is much less of a selling point, being Leech Spore Casket, which lets you heal friendly Inexorable vehicles within 18 inches by 1 wound for every model the bearer of this relic destroys, up to a maximum of 3 wounds per vehicle. This just seems like a ton of setup that requires you to have injured vehicles in close proximity to a model destroying other models to gain a benefit. Maybe this could be played with blood drones or blight haulers who have melee profiles themselves and want to be in the front line alongside your characters, which usually want to be leading the charge. But there are plenty of other good relics before this, so it's really not worth it in most cases. The Inexorable offer a rather strong contagion as well as a decently strong stratagem, but have a generally underwhelming relic. That being said, as relics are usually the least of your concerns, due to how many good generic relics there are, it's easy to see why the Inexorable are currently the most popular, as their stratagem and their warlord contagion trait are very powerful and can make up for an underwhelming relic rather easily. Following the Inexorable come the Ferrymen in second place. The Ferrymen plague company have 3 benefits, which are all useful to some extent and can be rather good in the game. Their stratagem is called Undroning Wings, and for 1 command point it lets you select a Foetid Varion and extend one of its aura abilities by 6 inches to a maximum of 12 inches. While the aura abilities you can pick from aren't the most vital, it's a nice ability to have when you need a unit to be within range of one of their auras. For a warlord contagion trait, the Ferrymen have the droning ability, which halves the movement characteristic of enemies within range of this contagion. It's a reasonable ability, but it's not as impactful as some other contagions can be at times. The relic the Ferrymen have is the Ferryman Scythe, which replaces a Man Reaper on a model and has the same profile as the Man Reaper, but the scything mode of the Ferryman Scythe makes 3 hit rolls per attack instead of 2. This might not seem like much on the surface level, but on a Lord of Contagion, this adds 5 attacks when making a scythe attack, if not more in the event of other modifiers modifiers. As a whole, the Ferrymen offer the most usable options, but all of their options are just alright. Normally this would lower the standing of the subfaction, but as the plague companies offer limited benefits to begin with, it's not as much of a detriment to their playability as it may have been in other cases. The plague company known as Mortarion's Anvil comes in 3rd place and is the last of the plague companies that have so far placed within tournaments. But do keep in mind that the codex is still somewhat new, so other companies may show up within the high ranks of tournament play as time goes on. Their stratagem is called the Relaptic Assault, which lets them choose any number of Mortarion's Anvil units and lets them perform a heroic intervention as if they were a character on an enemy unit within 3 inches that has charged one of your Mortarion's Anvil units. This can really let you swing the outcome of a combat phase and scare off would-be melee threats in some cases, so this can be a rather powerful stratagem when it does go into effect. The Warlord Contagion trait for them is called Gloombloat and offers 2 different debuffs, the first being enemies within range can't fire Overwatch or set to defend, the second being that enemies cannot reroll hit or wound rolls. The first half of the ability is a nice additional perk, but is not really why you want this contagion, while the second half can be rather brutal against some targets that make heavy use of rerolls, though if the enemy does happen to roll very well, this might not have much use at all. Finally, for the relics, they have the Warp Insect Hive, which lets the bearer reroll hit and wound rolls if they desire, making it the inverse of the contagion ability for the bearer of this relic. As far as relics go, this can be a rather good one on some models. Overall, I think we'll probably see the Mortarion's Anvil overtake the Ferrymen within tournament play, as both offer 3 reasonably good benefits, but the Mortarion's Anvil has 3 options that seem a bit more powerful when they're useful than that of the Ferrymen. For a 4th plague company being the Wretched and the plague companies that will follow it, there isn't any data to suggest which is the most prevalent within the tournament space, so going forward the following is my opinion directly in terms of where they rank. Some of these can definitely one day find themselves within the top 4 of tournaments. The Wretched have an interesting stratagem that is called Sevenfold Blessing, and for 1 command point it allows a Wretched Psyker to pick an additional psychic power, and once per phase you can reroll the psychic test for that model. You're only allowed to use the stratagem once per battle, and it can be rather powerful if you're looking to power up a Psyker in your army. The Warlord trait for the Wretched, known as the Eater Plague, states that each time a friendly Wretched model makes an unmodified hit roll of 6 against an enemy in range of this contagion, the attack automatically wounds. This isn't that impressive as most units in the Death Guard forces have a reasonable strength profile, but if you have a swarm of Poxwalkers or something of the sort, this can really help them push some wounds through, though even outside of that, benefiting other units with this contagion isn't the worst thing in the world either. Continuing the Psyker theme of the stratagem, the relic for the Wretched is the Demon's Favor, which can only go on a Malignant Plaguecaster, and it replaces the Pestilent Fallout ability with the Torrent of Putrefaction ability. This ability states that when you successfully cast a psychic power, if you rolled higher than a 7, you choose the closest enemy unit within 12 inches and they suffer d3 mortal wounds. But if you rolled under a 7, you choose the closest enemy within 6 inches and they suffer 1 mortal wound instead. This relic can actually be rather good if you're making full use of your Psykers, as you can start adding up the mortal wounds somewhat quickly, but it is limited to how many mortal wounds this can cause over the course of the game, which makes it a bit more limited in terms of play overall. As a whole, I think the Wretched are rather interesting, and the stronger the Death Guard Psykers are, the stronger they become, so there could be a situation where a detachment of these guys show up to cause some havoc within a tournament. In 5th place for the plague companies comes Mortarion's Chosen Sons. The Mortarion's Chosen Sons stratagem is called the Plague Brewers. It costs 1 command point and benefits flamer-like weapons, and while the Plague Spear has a decent strength and at least some armor penetration, the issue is it's on the low end and most other options don't have the benefit of armor penetration at all. They could have given this ability extra armor penetration, especially when you compare it to something like the Blessed Bolts of the Sisters of Battle, which is a generic stratagem that brings Stormbolter Fire up to 2 armor penetration and to 2 damage, just like this brings up the Plague Spear up to 2 damage without locking them into a certain subfaction. So all this does is just add 1 damage to the damage profile while not adding any additional armor penetration, and that's really where the downfall is of this stratagem. Hopefully one day it gets a little more benefit so that it can be a little bit more competitive. The Warlord trait of Mortarion's Chosen Sons is called Nurgle's Fruit, and the contagion says that enemies get no cover save against attacks when in range of this contagion. It's an okay contagion, it's not great, but it's not terrible either. This type of ability is actually rather powerful, but it's not uncommon on certain weapons, and having to place a unit in range of enemies with a cover save makes it a more limited contagion in that sense. Their relic, the Vomitrix, is actually pretty good, while also taking it from heavy d6 to assault 7, which means not only do you get the maximum number of attacks each time you fire the weapon, but you actually get more than the maximum each time by 1, and as it's an assault weapon you can advance and shoot with a weapon that auto hits, so you don't even suffer the penalties for advancing. If there's any reason to take this plague company, this is that reason, as it's one of the more powerful relics within the plague companies. It's hard to say who would show up in a tournament first, Mortarion's Chosen Sons or the Wretched, as both bring something interesting to the table and can potentially be rather strong in the right circumstances. It's just a matter of what people focus on and what sees the most benefit in the meta as things change. In 6th place we come to Harbingers, and this is where the plague companies start falling off a bit in terms of power and tournament playability. The Harbinger stratagem is the Wrathful Dead, which costs 1 command point and can only be used on a unit of Harbinger Poxwalkers in the fight phase. And what it does is the selected unit can reroll hit rolls. Even though this is the Poxwalker subfaction, I would say in some ways the Wretched actually benefit the Poxwalkers a bit more with their Warlord Contagion trait. Speaking of Warlord Contagion traits, the Harbingers bring Shamble Rot to the table, which reads that enemy units within range of this contagion at the start of your opponent's movement phase suffer 1 mortal wound on a d6 roll of 4+, and suffer d3 mortal wounds on an unmodified roll of 6. This can be alright if you're in range of multiple enemy units, as it can produce a few extra mortal wounds throughout the game. However, many other contagions and generic warlord traits just do a bit more than this, so it's definitely not going to be something that you go out of your way just to take this play company for. Even though Shamble Rot itself is a bit mediocre, the relic for the Harbingers is called Infected Remains and allows the bearing model to mark an objective to produce all of the contagions of the bearer. As such, you can use this to produce a second instance of Shamble Rot and then potentially get a third instance of Shamble Rot off of Flash Outbreak. The biggest issue with this is contagions are not cumulative, as mentioned before, so each enemy can only be affected once by each contagion, but you can use this to create an area of contagion and then move to a different location to influence both areas with that contagion, so it makes it harder for your opponent to hold that objective even if you're not in range of that objective anymore. It's a bit on the niche side, but it could be a lot of fun to play in certain games. To wrap up the Harbingers, I don't think they're unplayable, I just think they're a bit too gimmicky and will have a hard time competing with some of the plague companies in the long run. However, I should mention that they do have Typhus as a special character, so maybe if he receives a tweak in points to be more viable, we'll see Harbingers seeing some success, and as such I wouldn't count them out quite yet, as their abilities can be a bit of fun to play, and Typhus can be rather powerful if his points are reduced in order to make him a power unit, as a great leader that promotes the Harbingers as a plague company even if their other abilities are not as good as some of the other plague companies. In last place we come to the Poxmongers, and while I can see most of the other plague companies making an appearance in high level tournament play, I don't really see a world in which Poxmongers make it to the top, unfortunately, as they're just too clunky with everything that they bring. Their stratagem for 1 command point is Bilious Blood Rush and allows you to select 1 Poxmonger demon engine to allow it to fire blast weapons in engagement range, and they gain +1 to hit when they're doing so. This stratagem doesn't really make sense to me as it affects very few units, as it's restricted to blast weapons in engagement range on demon engines specifically. Remember, the entropy cannons on the Plague Burst Crawler aren't a blast weapon, so that cuts things down even more. The unit that benefits the most from this is the Mephitic Blade Haulers, as they have more than 1 blast weapon and can be taken in units of more than 1, which means you can get more out of it. It's still very much a mediocre stratagem, and most of the time it won't even do anything, or if it does, it still might not be enough to actually matter, though there might be some situations in which you let something like a Plague Burst Crawler or Blight Haulers break out of a melee combat and proceed to do some damage elsewhere, though once again it's a very situational ability, so in a lot of cases it might just not do anything. Their warlord trait is the contagion known as Sanguinous Flux, and what it does is it subtracts 1 from the enemy's leadership and combat attrition tests within range of this contagion. Even with 9th edition making leadership and morale more important, this still doesn't make it particularly good, and usually you'll just be fine without it, so the warlord contagion trait for the Poxmongers really isn't much salvation in that sense. The Poxmonger relic is called the Ironclad Furnace, and what it does is it gives a 4+ invulnerable save to a selected unit of demon engines within 6 inches of the bearer of this relic. Again, it's best with the Blight Haulers, which are a little bit overcosted at this time, so they're not as playable as one would like, but still it's not that good, as Blight Haulers, Bloat Drones, and Plague Burst Crawlers all have a 5+ invulnerable save naturally, and this only buffs it by 1 in that situation. Sadly though, this is probably the best justification for taking this plague company, with the stratagem being not too far behind in power level, unfortunately. The Poxmongers are a plague company that focuses on demon engines, but seems to just fall flat in most cases. Maybe if the Blight Haulers see some points reductions and you can take them as the core of your army, this plague company might be more viable, but even then it's a minor buff to the units it benefits, and as it is, it's just not very good. Now that we've covered the plague companies, I'd like to quickly go over the deadly pathogens that the Death Guard can take, as they don't really warrant a video in themselves, but are hard to cover outside of a topic in themselves. Deadly pathogens are a rather unique ability to the Death Guard, and what they do is you can choose a character or Bubonic Astartes champion and upgrade one of their plague weapons with a deadly pathogen. Each pathogen has a special ability in addition to giving the weapon +1 strength, so it's important to take into account the strength break points as well as the ability the deadly pathogen provides. Most deadly pathogens are somewhat expensive in points and increase the power level of the unit by 1, which could be relevant for strategic reserves. More so, they cannot be taken on named characters or buff relics or grenades, and can only be taken once on each character as well as only once per army, but can be taken in addition to traits. The following deadly pathogens come up in order of frequency that they see play within tournaments. The first deadly pathogen, known as Vicious Death, is by far the most commonly used deadly pathogen, and this is because not only is it 10 points, but also lets you reroll rolls that randomly generate a number of attacks. As such, it's incredibly good on the Foul Blight Spawn's Plague Sprayer, which goes up to the important strength of 8 with this and is rather strong, meaning that rerolling the number of shots with this can be very good in the situation where it can add shots to an already powerful weapon. Combine this with the low points cost of this Deadly Pathogen and it becomes an easy choice in most armies. In number 2, Unstable Sickness is sometimes used, mostly on strong models such as the Lord of Contagion, who can put out a good number of attacks, and once again the Lord of Contagion's Man Reaper goes up to 6 or 8 strength, both of which are breakpoints depending on which mode it chooses. Unstable Sickness states that if a weapon destroys a model in a unit, you roll a d6 and on a roll of 4+, the enemy unit suffers 1 mortal wound, to a maximum of 3 mortal wounds. If the Lord of Contagion is using the scything profile of his Man Reaper, he can easily reach the maximum number of mortal wounds against more swarmy targets. Once again, this is a lower costing pathogen at the points cost of 15 points. In third place, Virulent Fever is the last of the commonly used pathogens within tournaments, and it's on the high end at 20 points, but it can be decent with a large number of attacks as it generates mortal wounds on an unmodified roll of 6 when attacks are made with this weapon. Befouling Runoff isn't a pathogen that has seen use yet, but it's only 10 points, so if you're just looking to buff the strength profile of a weapon, this is the best choice outside of Vicious Death, which has a specific use already, and generally you'll be taking that on your Foul Blight spawn. Befouling Runoff simply ignores cover benefits for attacks made with this weapon, which isn't a bad ability either, but it's not something you're necessarily looking for on a plague weapon. After that, in 5th place, Corrosive Filth increases the damage characteristic of attacks against vehicles. At 20 points for this ability, it's probably a bit on the expensive side, but it can find a home someday if vehicles become very common in the meta. Explosive Outbreak is the next Deadly Pathogen, and it is another 20-point pathogen that scores an additional hit on an unmodified roll of 6 to hit. This can see some play with something like the Man Reaper Scything profile, as that does get a lot of attacks, especially on a Lord of Contagion who has 5 base attacks. Unfortunately, I should mention it does not stack with the relic benefits of the Toll Keeper, which is a relatively common relic in the armies that include the Fated Vorian known as the Toll Keeper. Finally, in 7th place comes the Acidic Malady, and the Acidic Malady might be better than I'm giving it credit for, but it does cost 20 points and increases the armor penetration of the weapon by 1. Normally I value armor penetration rather highly, but many of the plague weapons on characters have a naturally high armor penetration, so it's a bit redundant in many cases for the amount of points that it costs. But there will be weapons that benefit from this as well, so it's definitely one that you can take in some cases in order to get both the benefit of the strength and the armor penetration, because there will be times where this can do a lot of work and it'll definitely be worth it. It's just a matter of which weapon you take it on, so this can either be the 7th place Deadly Pathogen or it can go up as high as 4th place or better, depending on which weapon you take it on and how you use it within an army. As a whole, most of the pathogens are definitely useful, but the points do add up rather quickly on the already points intensive Death Guard units. We'll discuss the Deadly Pathogens more as we cover units that benefit from them the most, but I wanted to give a quick rundown on them in this video to have a central location for all of them so that people can see what each one does and how each one kind of fits in within the army. And again, just because I ranked them in a certain way, I was ranking them as more of an overall decision as opposed to in specific cases, so there will be certain cases where a pathogen I've rated on the lower end goes up in power specifically when used in a specific way. So don't take it as gospel that a pathogen is only ever ranked in the position that I ranked it, because as I mentioned, something like Acidic Malady can be incredibly different in power rating depending on which weapon it goes on due to the widespread and armor penetration that some of the plague weapons have. Anyway, if you've enjoyed the content, please like, subscribe, and share, as it does really help the channel out and it helps other players discover the channel so that they may benefit from the content when buying and building their armies. I'd also like to thank my patrons for their support. They're incredibly awesome people and they're a source of great motivation for me. And as always, whether you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time.